Iran said the Strait of Hormuz would not reopen until Lebanon was quiet. That was the headline. That was the pressure point. That was the sentence designed to move faster than a tanker, faster than a diplomat, faster than a market desk could breathe. But look at the timing. The talks were supposed to be about stopping a wider war. The public language sounded careful enough. Interim agreement, technical negotiations, ceasefire commitments, safe passage, de-escalation, nuclear framework, 60 days. It sounded like governments trying to turn chaos into a calendar. Then Lebanon came back into the room. And once Lebanon came back into the room, Iran reached for the one lever that does not only speak to Washington or Jerusalem. It speaks to Tokyo, it speaks to Beijing, it speaks to New Delhi. It speaks to every insurer, trader, refinery, shipping company, and energy minister watching the Persian Gulf with one eye open. Hormuz. Now pause there. The question is not whether Iran placed a physical gate across the water. The question is not whether a cartoon map can draw a red line and declare the artery closed. The real question is much more dangerous. Did Iran make the world behave as if the gate might be closing? Because once fear changes behavior, fear becomes a weapon. The United States said Iran did not control the Strait of Hormuz. U.S. Central Command said traffic continued to flow. It said American forces were monitoring the situation. It said 55 merchant ships had passed through Saturday with more than 17 million barrels of oil. That is the official story. But then Reuters reported the shipping data. 5 vessels passed through on Sunday. 5. The previous day, 26 ships had been spotted. According to Kepler data cited by Reuters, the flow did not just wobble, it fell sharply. And inside that number were 3 very large crude carriers, each carrying around 2 million barrels of Saudi crude and fuel oil. That is not theater. That is behavior. And behavior is where the official story begins to crack. Because a strait like Hormuz does not have to be sealed like a locked door to become a global crisis. It only has to become uncertain enough that ship owners hesitate, insurers reprice risk, buyers look for alternatives, and Gulf producers start offering cargoes with loading options inside and outside the waterway. That is not a blockade in the old sense. That is a psychological blockade. It is the difference between a door being locked and everyone in the building suddenly believing the door may explode. Follow the money, then follow the fear. Iran did not simply say, we are angry about Lebanon. It tied the reopening of Hormuz to 2 separate demands. First, the ceasefire in Lebanon had to be respected. Second, waivers allowing the sale of Iranian oil had to be issued. That combination matters. One demand sounded moral. Lebanon, ceasefire, stop the strikes, stop the killing. The other sounded economic. Oil waiver, relief, breathing room. And when a state ties morality to money, you should pay very close attention. Because that is usually where the real negotiation is hiding. The public conversation will ask whether Iran overplayed its hand. It will ask whether the United States called the bluff. It will ask whether Israel will stop, whether Hezbollah will commit, whether ships will move, whether oil will spike. Those are important questions. But they are not the deepest question. The deepest question is this: who was Iran really trying to trap? At first glance, the answer looks obvious. Iran was pressuring Israel. Israel had continued operations in Lebanon. Hezbollah was still firing. Southern Lebanon was still bleeding. If Tehran could connect Hormuz to Lebanon, it could raise the cost of every Israeli move. But that is only the surface. Iran was not only pressuring Israel. Iran was pressuring the United States to prove that it could control Israel. That is the trap. The U.S.-Iran agreement could speak in elegant diplomatic language. It could say ceasefire. It could say all fronts. It could say safe passage. But Israel and Hezbollah were not the signatories to that deal. They were not the hands that signed the paper. And yet they were the hands holding the match. Here is the part they do not want to explain. If Israel keeps striking Lebanon, Iran can say America failed to enforce the deal. If Hezbollah keeps firing, America can say Iran failed to control its proxy. If both happen at the same time, then the agreement becomes less like a peace framework and more like a bridge built over a fire. Everybody can see the bridge. Nobody wants to talk about the fire. This is why Hormuz became so powerful in that moment, not because Iran had perfect control over every ship, not because Tehran could close the waterway forever without consequences, but because it could inject uncertainty into the one place where uncertainty becomes instantly global. Hormuz is not just water. It is a narrow throat through which the world breathes oil. When that throat tightens, even slightly, markets listen, governments listen, militaries listen. Countries that do not care about Lebanon suddenly care about Lebanon. Countries that do not want to choose sides suddenly want the strait open before Monday morning. That is leverage. And leverage is rarely clean. The strategic model here is what I would call the 2-room trap. In the first room, diplomats sit around the table. They use clean words, roadmap, mechanism, extension, technical talks, safe passage, 60 days. In the second room, ships slow down, jets fly, Hezbollah fires, Israel answers, oil traders refresh screens, and military commands issue denials. The mistake most viewers make is that they only watch the first room. Iran forced everyone to look into the second. Look at the timing again. The talks in Switzerland were supposed to add details to an interim agreement. Vice President J.D. Vance was heading there. Iranian negotiators were arriving. Qatar and Pakistan were involved. The public script was about diplomacy moving forward. Then the strait closed again. Not weeks later. Not after talks collapsed. Right before the next diplomatic phase. That is not a coincidence. It turned the meeting from a negotiation about future terms into a negotiation under immediate pressure. Suddenly, safe passage was not an abstract clause. It was a live problem. Suddenly, Lebanon was not a regional side file. It was attached to the world's oil artery. This is how a weaker power negotiates with a stronger one. It does not always meet force with force. It moves sideways. It links theaters. It makes one crisis infect another. It takes a local battlefield and wires it to a global choke point. That is horizontal escalation. And when it works, the stronger power discovers that its strength is trapped inside multiple obligations. The United States has overwhelming military power. No serious analyst should pretend otherwise. It can monitor the strait, it can escort ships, it can strike targets, it can threaten Iran, it can reassure allies. But reassurance is not the same as control. And control is not the same as confidence. The U.S. could say ships were still moving. That was true according to the official line. But the data showing a sharp fall from 26 ships to 5 told another truth. The market was not only listening to Washington, it was listening to risk. Risk does not wait for permission. Risk does not need a formal press conference. Risk moves quietly, like a shadow under the door. This is why Iran's move was so dangerous. It turned the difference between closed and not closed into a gray zone. And gray zones are where modern coercion lives. If Iran fully closes Hormuz, it invites massive retaliation. If Iran does nothing, it loses leverage. But if Iran creates enough uncertainty to slow traffic while denying or modulating escalation, it forces every other actor to calculate. That calculation is the weapon. Now bring Lebanon back in. Lebanon is not just a battlefield. It is a credibility test. Israel wanted the ability to respond to Hezbollah. Hezbollah wanted Israel to stop operations and commit to withdrawal. Iran wanted the ceasefire to become binding. The United States wanted the entire thing to stop poisoning the talks. Everybody wanted peace. But nobody wanted to surrender freedom of action. That is the hidden contradiction. A ceasefire where every actor keeps a private exception is not a ceasefire. It is a pause with knives under the table. Israel said it had received directives to cease fire but retained the right to respond. Hezbollah said it would commit if Israel did. Iran said Hormuz would not reopen unless Israel publicly complied with a comprehensive ceasefire. The United States said Iran did not control the strait. Every sentence sounded reasonable from the speaker's point of view. Together they formed a machine designed to break. The question is not what they said. The question is what they moved. Ships moved differently. Negotiators moved to Switzerland. Oil officials were part of the Iranian delegation. Mediators moved between rooms. Military spokesmen moved to deny panic. And Gulf producers moved to offer crude loading flexibility inside and outside Hormuz. That last detail matters more than most people realize. When producers start giving buyers options around a choke point, they are not making poetry. They are managing danger. It means the risk has entered commercial planning. The map has become a price. The headline has become a contract clause. This is how geopolitics becomes real. Not when a leader speaks. When a buyer changes the loading terms. And that brings us to the oil waiver demand. Iran's language placed Lebanon in front. But the oil waiver demand revealed the second layer. Tehran was not simply trying to look like the defender of Lebanon. It was trying to turn maritime pressure into economic relief. Sanctions are not a wall. They are a slow tightening belt around the ribs of a state. Iran wanted that belt loosened. Oil waivers mean revenue. Revenue means oxygen. Oxygen means the ability to pay, stabilize, reward, rebuild, and survive the next round of pressure. So when Iran tied Hormuz to oil waivers, it exposed the bargaining structure. Lebanon was the trigger. Hormuz was the lever. Oil relief was the prize. And the United States was the actor Iran needed to make all three connect. This is why the move was both clever and risky. Clever, because it forced the United States to negotiate not only over nuclear timelines, but over enforcement, shipping, Lebanon, and economic relief at the same time. Risky, because it also gave Washington a powerful counterargument. Iran was proving that it could weaponize global energy flows when dissatisfied. That counterargument is not weak. We have to treat it seriously. A smart critic would say Iran's move was reckless. They would say Tehran tried to internationalize a local conflict by threatening a global waterway. They would say this harms Asian buyers more than Israel. They would say it gives the United States a justification to harden its position. They would say Iran confused leverage with blackmail. And they would not be entirely wrong. Because Hormuz is not a private Iranian bargaining chip. It is a global artery. When Iran touches it, it does not only pressure Washington, it pressures importers in Asia, Gulf producers, neutral shippers, insurers, and energy consumers who had no seat in the Lebanon crisis. That is why the tactic can backfire. A choke point is powerful because everyone needs it. But it is dangerous for the same reason. If you threaten something everyone needs, you may unite people who otherwise disagree. This is the strongest argument against the thesis that Iran trapped America. Maybe Iran trapped itself. Maybe by tying Hormuz to Lebanon and oil waivers, Tehran revealed desperation. Maybe the sudden shipping slowdown was not proof of Iranian strength, but proof that the market saw Iran as unpredictable. That interpretation deserves respect, but it cannot explain everything. It cannot explain why the issue of safe commercial passage became central enough to require communication mechanisms. It cannot explain why Lebanon, a front outside the formal Iran signature structure, became decisive. It cannot explain why 5 vessels on Sunday mattered more than a military denial on Saturday. It cannot explain why Washington had to talk while threatening. And it cannot explain why Iran's demand was structured so carefully. Not simply stop attacking us, but make Lebanon quiet and let our oil move. That is not random rage. That is a negotiating map. Iran was not only saying we can disrupt the world. It was saying if you want the world to move normally, then you must treat our regional red lines and our economic demands as part of the same file. That is the real shock. The nuclear file was no longer just nuclear. The Lebanon file was no longer just Lebanon. The shipping file was no longer just shipping. Everything was tied together. And once everything is tied together, every actor becomes hostage to the weakest link. The weakest link was Lebanon. Not because Lebanon was unimportant, but because it was the least controllable piece. Washington could speak to Iran. Iran could influence Hezbollah, but not always command every battlefield outcome. The United States could pressure Israel, but not erase Israel's security calculations. Israel could strike Hezbollah, but not force Hezbollah into political submission. So the entire diplomatic structure rested on a front where every actor had reasons to keep fighting. That is how panic starts. Not from one dramatic explosion. From a system where each side believes its own exception is reasonable. Israel says it must respond. Hezbollah says it will stop if Israel stops. Iran says it will reopen if Lebanon is respected. The United States says traffic is still flowing. And the ships slow down anyway. This is the image you should keep in your mind. A room full of officials arguing over whether the door is open, while the crowd outside stops walking through it. That is the difference between official reality and strategic reality. Official reality says the strait is not controlled by Iran. Strategic reality says enough people feared Iran's move to alter behavior. Official reality says talks are continuing. Strategic reality says the talks are happening under the shadow of an energy artery. Official reality says a ceasefire can be arranged. Strategic reality says the parties with guns may not obey the parties with pens. Now look at the 60-day window. A 60-day deadline sounds like structure. It gives viewers the comforting illusion of time. 2 months, a roadmap, technical talks, a final agreement somewhere ahead. But in geopolitics, a deadline is not only a calendar. It is a fuse. Every actor now knows the clock exists. Iran knows it. Israel knows it. Hezbollah knows it. Gulf producers know it. Traders know it. Washington knows that every violation, every ship delay, every rocket, every strike can become evidence that the agreement is failing. A fuse changes behavior before it burns down. That is why the next moves matter more than the statements. Movement is expensive. A tanker changing course is expensive. An insurance premium rising is expensive. A ceasefire violation is expensive. A waiver is expensive politically. A public retreat is expensive domestically. So do not only watch what officials say, watch what they pay for. If Iran really has leverage, you will see it in concessions, communication lines, oil waivers, and pressure on Israel to reduce operations in Lebanon. If Washington really called the bluff, you will see shipping normalize quickly, oil prices cool, and Iran walk back the threat without gaining much. If Israel refuses the Lebanon constraint, you will see the entire mechanism shake again. And if Hezbollah keeps firing, Iran's own credibility becomes complicated, because the United States will ask the obvious question. If Tehran can tie Hormuz to Lebanon, can Tehran also untie Lebanon from war? That is the trap inside the trap. Iran wanted to make America responsible for Israel. America can now try to make Iran responsible for Hezbollah. An alliance is not a family photo. It is a room full of countries pretending not to count the knives. That applies to both sides. The U.S. relationship with Israel is not a remote control. It is a strategic bond with tensions, domestic politics, security fears, and limits. Iran's relationship with Hezbollah is not a clean chain of command either. It is influence, ideology, funding, shared enemies, and battlefield reality. Both sides can pressure their partners. Neither side can perfectly puppeteer them. And yet the deal needs both to behave as if they can. That is why this moment was so unstable. The public wanted a clean story. Iran closed, denied it. Talks continued. But the deeper story is messier and more dangerous. Iran used the possibility of closure to turn Lebanon into a global shipping issue and to turn oil waivers into a condition of maritime calm. That is the entire architecture. A local ceasefire became a global price signal. A waterway became a bargaining table. A shipping slowdown became a political message. And the message was simple: if the Gulf will not feel normal. Now, was Iran bluffing? Partly, maybe. But a bluff in geopolitics is not the same as a bluff in poker. In poker, the cards are hidden. In geopolitics, the cards are partly visible, but the cost of calling the bluff may still be enormous. The United States can call Iran's bluff militarily. But can it call it commercially? Can it force every ship owner to ignore risk? Can it force every buyer to dismiss uncertainty? Can it force every ally to accept rising energy anxiety while a 60-day deal hangs over the region? That is the part that makes Hormuz different. A military can challenge a blockade. It cannot command confidence by decree. Confidence is built when ships move, prices stabilize, and violations stop. Until then, every official denial is competing with every nervous captain looking at a route through narrow water. This is why the shipping number mattered so much. 5 vessels. That number cut through the speeches. It did not prove a total closure. It did not prove Iran had absolute command. It came with a caveat that vessels switching off transponders might be missing from the data. But even with that caveat, the signal was powerful. The flow had changed. And when flow changes at Hormuz, the world notices. There is another layer people miss: Asian exposure. Hormuz is not just a Middle East problem. A huge share of oil and LNG flows through that strait toward Asian markets. China, India, Japan, and South Korea are not background characters here. They are the giant silent audience in the theater. Iran knows that. The United States knows that. Gulf exporters know that. So when Hormuz becomes unstable, pressure does not only come from Washington. It can come from capitals that do not want to be dragged into Lebanon's war, but cannot ignore a threat to energy flows. That makes Iran's tactic broader than a military threat. It is a diplomatic broadcast to every country that depends on predictable Gulf energy. The message is, your stability is connected to our terms. That is brutal. But it is not irrational. Weakness often negotiates by threatening the routines of the strong. Iran cannot outmatch the United States fleet to fleet. It cannot force Israel to accept every demand by direct pressure alone. But it can make the system surrounding those actors feel the heat. That is why the word panic is useful but incomplete. Panic is what you see. Pressure is what creates it. The panic began when everyone realized that the neat boxes were gone. Lebanon was not in one box. Hormuz was not in another. Oil waivers were not in another. Nuclear talks were not in another. Iran tore the labels off the boxes. And then it asked Washington to sort them out before the market opened. That is a strategic move. But it also creates a burden Iran may not be able to carry. Because once Tehran ties Hormuz to Lebanon, every new fire in Lebanon becomes a test of Iranian restraint. If Iran threatens closure again and again, the threat may lose credibility. If it actually escalates, it may trigger military retaliation. If it backs down too quickly, it looks weak. This is the narrow bridge Tehran chose to walk. On one side is irrelevance. On the other side is escalation. The bridge is made of oil prices, ship movements, and deniable pressure. Washington faces its own bridge. If it dismisses Iran's threat, it must keep ships moving. If it concedes too visibly, it rewards coercion. If it pressures Israel too hard, it creates political blowback. If it pressures Israel too little, Iran can say America cannot enforce the deal. That is why both sides were trapped. But not equally. America had more power. Iran had more disruption. Power can destroy things. Disruption can make normal life impossible. In a crisis built around a choke point, disruption often punches above its weight. Now here is the callback. At the beginning, the official debate was whether Hormuz was closed. That was the wrong question. The better question was whether Hormuz had been transformed from a shipping lane into a negotiation weapon. And the answer is yes. Not because Iran controlled every mile of water. Not because every ship stopped. Not because the world immediately collapsed. But because the threat forced diplomats, militaries, markets, and regional actors to respond to the same signal at the same time. That is what leverage looks like when it becomes systemic. It does not sit in one place. It travels. From Beirut to Tehran. From Tehran to Hormuz. From Hormuz to oil desks. From oil desks to Washington. From Washington back to Jerusalem. And from Jerusalem back to southern Lebanon. That loop is the real story. A loop is harder to stop than a single event. You cannot bomb a loop out of existence. You cannot deny a loop at a press conference. You have to break one of its connections. So where can it break? It can break if Israel publicly and visibly reduces operations in Lebanon. It can break if Hezbollah stops firing long enough for the ceasefire to look real. It can break if Iran accepts a face-saving path to reopen Hormuz without getting every waiver immediately. It can break if the United States creates a credible, safe passage mechanism that shippers actually trust. But if none of those things happen, the loop tightens. And the next 48 to 72 hours become the test. First, watch the ship count through Hormuz. Not the slogans, not the denials, the count. If the number rebounds toward normal levels, fear is easing. If it stays low, then the market is still voting against the official story. Second, watch Lebanon for visible, verifiable restraint. Not a vague statement, not anonymous optimism. Watch whether Israeli strikes decrease, whether Hezbollah fire stops, and whether both sides behave like the ceasefire is more than paper. Third, watch the language around oil waivers and safe passage. If waivers become more concrete, or if a communication line for commercial vessels becomes operational and trusted, then Iran's pressure-extracted movement. If those details remain foggy, the crisis is only being postponed. Those are the three indicators. Minus ships. Minus Lebanon. Waivers. Everything else is noise until those move. Minus. And this is why the story matters beyond one weekend headline, one strait, or one ceasefire. It shows how modern power works when the battlefield is no longer a single map. A rocket in Lebanon can change a tanker route in the Gulf. A tanker route in the Gulf can change a negotiating position in Switzerland. A negotiating position in Switzerland can change the price of oil in Asia. The world is not separated into clean files. It is wired together. And the most dangerous actors are not always the ones who can cut the wire. Sometimes they are the ones who know exactly where to touch it. So when Iran tied Hormuz to Lebanon, the panic did not start because everyone believed the strait was sealed forever. The panic started because everyone understood the deeper message. Iran was saying that if its regional network burns, the global system will feel the smoke. And that leaves one final question. If peace now depends not only on what leaders promise, but on what ships believe, what markets fear, and what proxies obey, then who is really in control of the war?